Oh, and Shanice is here too. Good. Well, hello and welcome everyone. This is the Portland Clean Energy Community Benefits Fund Committee meeting. And we're gonna start, as we always do, with an opening inspiration. And I'm actually gonna kind of hand over the reins. I'm gonna stop sharing, and James is gonna play a video for the opening inspiration for today, and then we will move into the meeting. And James, I will keep track of people in the waiting room while you do that.
All right, great, thank you. And great to see everybody today, and thanks for joining us. So yeah, last weekend, the US commemorated Independence Day, a holiday that has a lot of different meanings to people around the country and around the world. And as we reflect on our current times and the fight for racial justice over many centuries, we must acknowledge that there have been great inequities in the promise and access to the rights of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And so on July 5th, 1852, a few years before the American Civil War, the great writer, abolitionist, and orator Frederick Douglass gave a speech entitled, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July?" And so we wanted to share a video that was recently released. Some of you may have already seen it, which features the descendants of Frederick Douglass reading excerpts of that speech, which is still very powerful and relevant today. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen here and also the video, and we'll see how this works.
We're not seeing your screen yet, James.
Oh, apologies. Okay. Let me try once more. Okay, now here we go.
Do I look there or look there? Okay.
Just like your, yeah.
Okay. My name is Alexa Ann Watson, and I am the great-great-great-granddaughter of Frederick
Douglass is my great-great-great-great.
I am the great-great-great-granddaughter of Frederick Douglass.
I am the great-great-great-grandchild.
I've been counting on my fingers since I was like 5.
Whenever you're ready, here we go.
This is the 4th of July. It is the birthday of your national independence and of your political freedom.
Fellow citizens, I shall not presume to dwell at length on the associations that cluster about this day. The simple story of it is that 76 years ago, the people of this country were British subjects.
Oppression makes a wise man mad. Your fathers were wise men, and if they did not go mad, they became restive under this treatment.
With brave men, there's always a remedy for oppression.
They succeeded, and today you reap the fruits of their success. The freedom gained is yours, and you, therefore, may properly celebrate this anniversary.
Fellow citizens, pardon me. Allow me to ask, why am I called upon to speak here today? What have I, or those I represent, to do with your national independence?
Are the great principles of political freedom and of natural justice embodied in that Declaration of Independence extended to us?
I am not included within the pale of this glorious anniversary.
Your high independence only reveals the immeasurable distance between us. The blessings in which you this day rejoice are not enjoyed in common.
The rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence bequeathed by your fathers is shared by you, not by me.
The sunlight that brought life and healing to you has brought stripes and death to me.
This 4th of July is yours, not mine.
You may rejoice, I must mourn.
Fellow citizens, Above your national tumultuous joy, I hear the mournful wail of millions.
At a time like this, scorching irony, not convincing argument is needed.
Oh, had I the ability and could reach the nation's ear, I would today pour out a fiery stream of biting ridicule, blasting reproach, withering sarcasm, and stern rebuke.
For it is not light that is needed, but fire.
It is not the gentle shower, but thunder.
We need the storm, the whirlwind, and the earthquake.
The feeling of the nation must be quickened.
The conscience of the nation must be roused.
The propriety of the nation must be startled.
The hypocrisy of the nation must be exposed.
And its crimes against God and man must be proclaimed and denounced.
What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him, more than all other days in the year, the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim.
To him, your celebration is a sham.
Your boasted liberty an unholy license.
Your national greatness, swelling vanity.
Your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless.
Your denunciations of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence.
Your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery.
Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings,
With all your religious parade and solemnity, are to him
Mere bombast.
Fraud.
deception,
Impiety.
and hypocrisy. There is not a nation on the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of these United States at this very hour. Allow me to say in conclusion, notwithstanding the dark picture I have this day presented of the state of the nation, I do not despair of this country.
Thank you, James. All right, I am going to try and do this little switch. Is the title slide back up in the view? Okay.
Yep, we're back. Thank you.
All right, thank you for that. And thank you all for taking a few minutes at the beginning of our agenda to watch that. So I'm going to go through some of the kind of protocols for the meeting, and then we'll move into introductions. So these are kind of same as they always are, but said for the benefit of reminder and for folks who don't normally or who haven't participated before. The chat box is to be used for committee members and staff. If you're having a technical problem that you think might be something that we are doing, you can use the chat box to send a message to staff, and we might be able to help you with that. The raise hand function is for committee members, as is the video and microphone, with the exception of the public comment period. We do ask folks to use the chat box to introduce themselves and also to indicate if they want to provide public comment. We do have one person who signed up ahead of time for public comment, if you do want to provide public comment, please put your name into the chat box. The meeting is being recorded, and there's also closed captioning available, and you can find that by going kind of to the little menu bar in Zoom, and the three dots that say more. That drop down menu has a view full transcript, and then you can see the real-time captioning of the meeting. So I'm going to start with introductions, and I guess just one more reminder to put your name, if you have an organizational affiliation, if you want to put gender pronouns, you can put that all into the chat box, and Sam will read those out at the end of the committee member and staff introductions. So let's start with committee members. Robin.
Hello, Robin Wang, committee member, he, him.
Faith.
Good evening, everyone. Faith Graham, she, her.
Jeffrey.
Jeffrey Moreland, committee member, he, him.
Rainfeast,
Rainfeast Junitino Viatoro, he, him, committee member.
Maria,
Maria Sippin, she, they, committee member.
Andrea,
Andrea Hamburg, she, her, committee member.
Shanice,
Shanice Clark, she, they, committee member.
and I would just note that Michael Eden Hill and Megan Horst, 2 committee members, are excused today. So now we'll move to staff. James,
Everybody, James Valdez, PCEF staff, he, him.
Janet,
Good evening, Janet Hammer, PCEF staff, she, her.
Sam,
Good evening, Sam Brasso, PCEF staff, he, him.
Wendy,
Wendy Kelfkin, BPS staff, supporting PCEF, she, her.
and I'm Katie Lister, PCEF staff. Sam, would you mind reading out the introductions from the chat box?
We've got Anissa Pemberton with us, they, them, Coalition of Communities of Color. Angela Providelli, she, her, Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. Mark Jackson, REAP Inc. James Meteor, Earth Advantage. James Donnelly, Elevate Energy. Deidre Schutz, Nutrition Garden RX, she, her. Amy Sissel, she, her, Habitat for Humanity, Portland, Metro East. Derek Thompson, 5 Star Goods, mentoring young adults through employment and wellness. Jay Ward, he, him, Energy Trust of Oregon. Elizabeth Lopez, Division Midway Alliance, she, her. Scott Sander, Exceed Enterprises, he, him. Gail Palmer, she, her, East Portland Action Plan and the Centennial Community Association. Joshua Baker, he, him, Lloyd Eco District. Diane Henkels, she, her, Small Business Utility Advocates. Chris Grube, Good Energy Retrofit and the Home Performance Guild. And Zakir Hakim, he, him, Eastside Solar, Minority Business, MBE.
All right, thanks, Sam. Before we move into public comment, I'd like to ask the committee members if they had any changes or comments or edits to the minutes from the July 6th, 17th. Now I'm forgetting what day it was, to the minutes that were sent out from the last committee meeting.
June 17th.
June 17th. July 17th is the future. So the looks like I'm seeing heads shaking. Looks like it is good. Okay, then those minutes are approved. And before we move into public comments, I wanted to just ask Sam to make a couple of quick program updates and announcements, and then we'll go to public comment.
Okay. On the positive note is thank you to James, Angela, Wendy, and certainly others on the team, but we will be getting out and releasing our application support grants, which you all approved a little bit now, but we will be pushing those out here, aiming to go live tomorrow. Fingers crossed, I think we should be able to do it. If not tomorrow, we'll go live Monday. We'll give folks 3 weeks to apply. So just as you see that come out, both to committee members as well as folks in the audience, just be on the lookout and love to help us get the word out, certainly to small nonprofits, certainly those focused on BIPOC organizations. So BIPOC serving organizations. So hats off to them, but that'll be out here shortly. As well, just an update, it's because I know folks are wondering, but we have not reconvened our subcommittee on the member recruitment, aiming to get that out here. So keep an eye out to, it's really Marie, I think, is the only member present. Otherwise, it's Megan and Michael are both absent, but we'll schedule that and get that moving next week. So I think that's really it at a top level in terms of the updates. Yeah.
Okay.
So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Katie.
Yeah, and it looks like it looks like we had another person put their name in the chat box, Maggie Johnson, Director of Development from Cascada Behavioral Healthcare. And then James just let me know there were a few people on the phone. So can you unmute the phone line, James?
Yep, unmuting right now.
So looks like we have 3 folks on the phone. Would you mind introducing yourself? You can start with the number that is 971246 that starts that way.
Brian Denny, healthyhabitat.org and Home Performance Guild.
Okay, thanks. And then the number that starts with 541270.
That's probably mine, Diane Hinkles, with Small Business Utility Advocates. I'm phone audio, Zoom video.
And are either of you interested in providing public comment today?
No.
No. Okay.
No,
It looks like the other phone line dropped off. So you can go ahead and mute those. Thank you. Okay, so it appears that we have one person signed up for public comment, Jay Ward from Energy Trust of Oregon. And I'd like to invite Jay to unmute yourself and make yourself visible on video if you're interested in doing that.
Okay, I should be both. Can you hear me?
We can hear you and see you.
Excellent, thank you. And thanks for the opportunity to address the committee and attendees this evening. In particular, I want to thank the committee members for your ongoing work to breathe life into this extraordinary campaign. For the record, Jay Ward, Energy Trust of Oregon. And since some in the audience might have missed our presentation to the committee in December, Energy Trust is an independent nonprofit that provides energy efficiency and renewable energy services to the customers of PGE, Pacific Power, Northwest Natural, Cascade Natural Gas, and Avista. All Portland residents are eligible for our programs and incentives, but we're not ignorant of the fact that many Portlanders haven't been able to take advantage of them. We want to change that so that customers, particularly Black, Indigenous, people of color, and others whom we have underserved can benefit from our clean energy work. To that end, we're hosting an information session next Thursday, July 16th, from noon to 1:30. Like seemingly all meetings these days, in the interest of preventing COVID transmission, this one will be over Zoom. And during that session, we will seek to better understand potential PCEF applicants' needs, and will offer information on ways that they may be able to partner with Energy Trust to leverage our programs and incentives, should they so choose. PCEF staff were kind enough to send out an announcement and registration email this afternoon. If anyone has not already received that email, they've agreed to put a link to it in the chat bar. Thanks again for giving Energy Trust the gift of your time this evening, and we hope to see some or all of you next Thursday. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Jay. Okay, so now we're going to move into it. The first thing on the agenda is a discussion of the public input that we received during the public comment period on the draft application and scoring criteria. And I'm gonna, there really are just 3 slides in this slide deck, but there was an accompanying kind of more full summary of the feedback that we received that we sent to committee members last week, and that is also posted on our PCEF website for members of the public to look at it. So we may reference that document as well, but just for the purposes of making a PowerPoint that looks reasonable, all of those words aren't included here. What we wanted to do was just talk about a little bit about, go over kind of 3 slides. The first 2 are just really some key themes that kind of bubbled up from the feedback that we got from webinars that we held, webinars that we co-hosted with other organizations, one-on-one meetings, an online survey, and then emailed in responses and public input. So it's a combination of all of those sources that went into that summary document. And then I will turn it over to Sam to talk a little bit about kind of what we're doing with that information. So these are the key themes that arose from all responders, and that includes white-led organizations and BIPOC-led organizations. Respondents were primarily nonprofit organizations, but there were also a small handful of individuals and also some members of the business community who provided input, and a few, kind of like a very few, but a few folks from other government agencies. The sort of main key themes that arose from all responders were that the draft applications are too complex for many or perhaps most organizations that are small and not already well established. That prioritizing geography east of 82nd and low-income census tracts leaves out some members of priority populations and has some other unintended consequences. And some of those are kind of explained in a little bit more detail in the larger summary document that we sent to you. And then the third one is that applicants will need assistance and clarity with GHG emissions reductions estimates. And one of the things that is evident to us is that there definitely is a need for technical assistance and a need for clear communication. So I think that we are hearing those messages loud and clear from a number of different sources. The key themes that arose from across BIPOC-led organizations, and I put organization entity responders just to sort of capture the fact that there was an individual responder and that they weren't all affiliated with an organization, but that the draft application feels too complex and asks for too much detail. There was a request to simplify and move that detail out of the scoring and into the grant agreements. There's a suggestion to de-emphasize the organization experience with similar grants and projects in order to create new opportunities. And I think if just a little bit of clarity there, I think that we probably will reword when we redraft, but wanted to make it clear that that suggestion is really a de-emphasis not on the organization's experience and history serving PCEF priority populations, but a de-emphasis on the experience with similar size and types of projects that PCEF is going to fund. And to do that in order to create new opportunities. The questions around racial and social justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion did not seem to be written with culturally specific organizations in mind and are difficult for them to answer. And that was a piece of feedback that we heard from a number of different organizations that had majority leadership were people of color, that they really felt like those questions were written for white-led organizations to answer. The responses indicate that, and then the last is just sort of a comment or like a finding more than a piece of feedback that we received, which is just that a lot of the responses indicated that the information requested was misunderstood. So as we had kind of follow-up conversations to really dig into what folks were having issues with, it became clear that we didn't do an adequate job communicating clearly what it was we were asking for. And so the critique was really just a misunderstanding of the statement. So it's a different kind of critique, I guess. So I'm going to turn it over to Sam unless there are any questions about that. After Sam is done with his slide, we are going to be asking committee members, to give us your thoughts and your initial reactions to the feedback that we received. Robin?
Yeah, just one quick clarifying question. When you say BIPOC-led, what's the definition of BIPOC-led organization?
So it is organizations that are led by Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Does that answer that? Is that leadership staff, or is it board, or both, or something else?
Yep.
Sam, do you want to take that since you have a lot more familiarity?
Yep. Yeah, generally speaking, we were looking at both leadership, organization leadership, executive director, top leadership, as well as board.
So if a board is more than 50% BIPOC represented, that would be considered BIPOC-led?
Yep, and at times it might have been 50%, and so we didn't draw a firm line around that, but yeah, generally speaking, that's right.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, we were mainly looking at the board and the executive leadership.
Okay, so Sam, I'm gonna turn it over to you.
Okay, so I think the framing here that we largely want to set you out in is that there's, we heard a lot of feedback, and we certainly sent you a summary of that feedback, and there's many ways to go about addressing that feedback, and it isn't necessarily one particular approach. And so what we just want to frame is that what we're going to be talking about, what we'll go into in some of the next sections, we'll be talking about how we're thinking about addressing this, but at a high level, some of the ways in which we're viewing addressing that feedback, and this doesn't capture all of it, but it's certainly one, just the obvious is changes to the actual draft grant application. So just the way that either the questions are asked, sometimes it's removing questions, and we'll get into what some of that actually looks like here shortly. to the way that we've reviewed how we can respond and address some of the core concerns that came out, which is changes to the actual scoring criteria. And this was an interesting one in that what we put out there was both application questions and scoring criteria. And so that's something that as we've gone through and as as we get to the next section around how we've gone about addressing some of those changes, what we're learning is that some folks focus squarely on the scoring criteria, and at times it was that scoring criteria actually needed to change, and at times it was that we need to pivot back and look at the grant questions. So there's acknowledgement that we put a lot out there, and I think so that was a little bit of that as well. And then the third thing will be it's just actually taking outright questions completely, which you heard a little bit of that suggestion, but taking questions out of the application and moving them to the grant agreement. So shifting that burden of responsibility from the application to the grant agreement so that so that they may be early deliverables of the project themselves or some way managed by the by the project managers. And this goes, without saying, we were sprinting to get the document out. We put out a 104-page document that landed with a thud. We ended up, a week later, we did come up with a more navigable website that helped guide folks through that, but that didn't change the fact that we put out a first draft. And that was it. It was everything coming together, a lot of work going on, but it was the first draft of putting all those words together. And so there's just, and as everyone seeing it for the first time, really all the pieces that have come together. So a lot of what we see that we need to address, and based on the comments and the conversations we've had afterwards, is just both improved clarity around the way we ask the questions, simplifying the way we ask the questions, and then just the layout themselves, things that we're certainly taking as a lot of lessons learned as we approach the RFP. And those are going to be really important things, just how folks actually engage with it. It can't be necessarily a 104-page PDF. So there's a lot of that we're working on, and we've been working with our comms team to lay out how we're going to approach that for the RFP. But a good chunk of the feedback ultimately came back to that as well. And so those are, at a high level, those are the 4 ways we view some of the changes that we're going to need to make in order to address some of the core concerns. And we think, which we'll talk a little bit about shortly here, but we think it's largely doable. So the considerations, as far as how we're going about it, what we started with, and we had our first workshop earlier this week, is we're going through and doing additional consultations with the organizations that provided the most critical, detailed feedback that really went through and understood all of the pieces that are also majority BIPOC-led. So we brought those organizations together because they've got a detailed understanding around how all the pieces relate to each other, because there was a lot of complexity there, but we wanted to make sure that those were focused on BIPOC-led organizations and those that provided some of the most critique. So we brought them back together and we're working through workshops, just making sure we fully understand their concerns, because sometimes it is just a misunderstanding in terms of the ways that we wrote out the scoring criteria, and that maybe it was the way that we need to ask the question slightly differently. So just going through to make sure we fully understand the concerns that have been laid out, as well as share some of our thoughts around how we think we can address those concerns and whether that sort of is tracking towards the right direction, recognizing we're not going to get everything perfect, and that's something that we'll go through here shortly around what those conversations are looking like. And as we're going through, the considerations we're taking in as a team, and certainly with others, and we hope that you all are thinking about ultimately, is that do the proposed changes address the concerns raised? If we are reducing information collected, what exactly are we losing? Are the changes that we're making consistent with the code and guiding principles? There's a lot of places where we have questions in there because of the code and guiding principles. And so sometimes we go back and say, where does that rub, and where do we need to provide additional clarification on where some of this stuff comes from? And then lastly is just, will the changes in the scoring matrix actually allow us, there's a lot of thoughtful information requests made in there, and will some of those changes allow us to still have the granularity to differentiate between one project and another? And that's going to be a key thing that you'll have to be thinking about. Well, I'll leave it there because we'll go through some of those pieces, but I think just an interesting thing I know we were certainly reflecting on, we give a lot of examples given. And that was one of those things in the scoring guide, that when folks saw examples given, oftentimes they saw those as requirements. And that often, and so there's just, some of that is going to be communication. It's going to be spelling out, this is purely an example, but it's a tension that we're navigating, is what does it mean to provide examples, and what is that, how do different folks respond to that? And that difference does certainly manifest across whether, I think those differences, it's fair to say that we think some of the folks that we had conversations with that were women POC felt that when they saw those criteria, and that I don't think that differs so much from employment, job recruitment, all those, they saw those as requirements. And so that's just also something that we're working through. So I think that at a high level just lays out some of the ways in which we're thinking about responding. I think before we move on, I think as we move into the next section, I want to just acknowledge that what we'll go through as a document, Katie will set you on there, but today what we expect to do is not necessarily, we certainly not get to the end of some of those discussions and deliberations, but walk you through those pieces. And I know we'll start out at a high level, one of the core changes we've made. But before we do that, I just want to check in and see sort of if folks have questions, thoughts about the way we're thinking about responding and moving ahead.
Andrea? Oh, and then Robin.
So you mentioned kind of consistency with the code and guiding principles, but what role are City of Portland requirements for contracts playing in the mix here?
I think I could take a little bit of a stab at answering that, Sam, and then maybe you can just add on. I would say that they're, at this point, not an enormous amount. I mean, I think that the primary, I mean, those will come into play kind of at the other end when we're, setting up actual grant agreements and we have to be, doing compliance with certifications and insurance and that kind of stuff. But in terms of the scoring criteria, I don't think a lot. There's certainly, as we've discussed with this committee, are limitations to the way in which we can prioritize Black and Indigenous people and organizations, not because of the city, but because of the larger federal laws. Yeah. Robin?
Thanks, Katie.
Mm-hmm.
I had a more clarifying question. The first point on the key themes across all responders. The first one says, the draft applications are too complex for most organizations that are small or not well established. And I guess I have a two-part question. One, was there any differentiation in the feedback between large grants and small grants? As you know, there's going to be two different grant application processes and criteria for large versus small grants. So I'm curious if there's any differentiation. And secondly, is can you define small or not well established?
So I think I can answer those questions no and no. So the first one, people primarily focused on the large grant application and scoring criteria. I mean, that's really where folks kind of zeroed in on. There were a handful of people who appeared to be really only interested in planning grants. And so we got some specific feedback on planning grants, but for the most part, people were pretty focused on the large grant application and scoring criteria. And then the second question is, no, I mean, those were comments, I think those were comments that came from other folks. And so I don't know what they were thinking when they said small or not well established. We could make assumptions about that, but I don't really know. We did definitely get comments from kind of more established, slightly larger, more mainstream organizations, or places that had grant writers on the staff that were sort of more along the lines of, yeah, this looks pretty par for the course, we could do this. But we think that it will be a heavy lift for small and not well-established organizations. So, but yeah, we don't really have a view into kind of what exactly they meant by that.
Okay, thank you.
Jeffrey?
Yeah, you just pretty much answered my question. It seemed like they were, a lot of the organizations we're talking about was the big grants. And I actually enjoyed their feedback and really appreciated it, because I think it gave us a whole lot to really think about, because end of the day, I think that's the goal for this whole program, is to graduate people and make it inclusive, even for the big grants. So yeah, but yeah, you answered my question. Thank you.
Shanice?
off mute. First, I just want to acknowledge or to appreciate the work that's been done to kind of think about some solutions and considerations that will shift the process or shift this criteria in the ways in which we had initially thought about it. And with the PCEF coalition and this work, as I think about maybe the spirit, right, of the ballot initiative and now what it is, I do think there's a role. There might be an inherent role which we value in our own practice to do capacity building, and so we're doing that along this journey. And so, just applying that lens in this moment, I definitely think there is a role, especially if we're talking about things that are very, of course, subjective, like how we might describe an organization's conditions. Generally speaking, I think the idea of a smaller organization or an organization that isn't your typical white-led dominant mainstream organization, those kinds of folks ought to be positioned to be benefited as the assumption is they're serving the folks who this fund is for. So I think there's some space to definitely carve that out. And as we think about the criteria, I know there's limitations, but there are ways we can think about this, especially as we frame our intentions and the beginning, right, of this criteria. You can begin to do that even in a formal way, an introduction, if you will, by naming. These are values you already know, but I don't know. Having some space to articulate that the context behind the funds, of course, inform the grant criteria. And this is some context that also is here. It's for Black folks, it's for Indigenous folks, but the actual grant criteria is a separate breakdown, right? So I think talking about that in a fashion that removes it from the actual, mechanisms, if you will, that are listed there, but also paired with it. So if that makes sense. So the pairing of the two things, I think, can be a way that we can, be in compliance and also be real about what needs to what these funds are for, right? I think the feedback we heard, there's definitely, I think, a struggle because these systems and the ways in which they're inherently designed, right, are why we are here. So there's some space to reflect. But I'm on the verge of rambling at this point. So that's all I wanted to lift up.
That's a good point.
Sorry. I think what I would add maybe and share, and this is a point I actually did mean to make earlier. I mean, this is there's a tremendous amount we're going to learn, and this is year one. I can't understate like that. This is there is so much we're going to learn, and we're not going to get this perfect. We're going to make these changes, and we still won't have it perfect. But it's important we listen in this. And I think one of the key things that we certainly heard is as we think about who we designed this for, this year we're going out with 8 million. And so we can, this is a learning year. We can adjust things, but next year we're going to have to readjust as we go out with 40, because that's going to imply it's just going to be a different scale. And so one of the things I do want to put in is when I mentioned number 3 above about shifting detail from the application to the grant agreement. One thing I want to be clear about what that implies ultimately is that it is bringing these questions and some of these elements of accountability into the grant agreement where the staff, the project managers on our team manage those projects. And so as we think about the kind of work that's going to need to happen, sometimes it means getting on bookkeepers, contracting on bookkeepers for these organizations, and the kind of detailed and really close work that needs to happen to make sure these folks are successful. It will be something that we will come back to this, but it will come down to administrative costs and what it means to manage the fund. And so we're learning a lot. 8 million, but when we get to that 40 million, it'll mean a different conversation. So that's something I just want to put a pin in because we will come back to that in time. And we'll learn and see how this goes. But I know that Renfish, you've had your hand up, so I don't want to pause there, and that's all I need to say there. But I just wanted to make sure that the committee is thinking about those other elements.
Yeah, same. I don't think I've actually, after your comments, I'm ready to hear, to dig in and hear what staff is. My only goal or North Star is, I hope we walk away with some kind of application where, community groups feel empowered to approach developers, approach contractors, and dream a new possibility. I think that's my hope. Folks feel like, hey, here, I know is it a competitive application? Let's dream of something new. And so, I'm ready to dig into what staff has to propose, but, I just wanted to be clear that that's kind of my guiding North Star, and really want to hear what staff has to propose on this.
Maybe before we go there, I'd like to just ask other members of the committee if they had any just kind of initial reactions or responses or thoughts. I know some of you have kind of shared those a little bit along with your questions and comments, but we had a listening session last time, but there was no opportunity for you as committee members to kind of articulate to each other how that landed, and then we just sent you a summary of the feedback that we got from a much broader kind of range. And so I just wanted to ask if anyone wanted to kind of share some thoughts on that before we take a deep dive in the weeds. No, I was just practicing. I have to tell you guys, because I was on a meeting today that the person who was facilitating left the longest silences. And I was like, this is so effective. Someone will speak. I saw Faith's hand go up.
I was going to let you go, Katie. I was fine.
No.
I really appreciated the listening session we had. Was it just last week? I don't remember. And, as somebody who was also kind of deeply involved on the subcommittee with this work, I was really disappointed we didn't get it more right. Because some of the points that were raised were things that we wrestled with so deeply. So I felt like the comments were right on, and I appreciated how much detail people put in, and the memo too is, first, you guys did an amazing job of organizing it, so thank you, because it was very, very, one could receive everything that was in there, so thank you. But also, all of the points that seem to have been made, they feel right on, and the biggest ones to me point to what Ron Feast was saying in the last comment, which is we just need to be sure that the applicants that we most want to benefit from this feel like this is their application. So what do we do to change it so that it, in fact, feels like an invitation instead of a hurdle? So I appreciate all of the effort and work and the way in which you staff are responding. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Faith. Anyone else?
Yeah, Katie, I have something else to add. I appreciated how you all helped organize all the feedback. I know it was a lot coming from many different directions, and I appreciate people weighing in and giving us time to look through these and giving us, a week to pause and to think through it. There was one particular theme or area that I wanted to learn more about and maybe consult with you all about, particularly the area where the Black, Indigenous, people of color groups talked about how the equity and inclusion questions were not designed with cultural responsiveness in mind. And this is where intent and outcome where intent and outcomes don't really align, and really would like to know how to better be more responsive to those groups, thinking about how we thought through that over and over with certain groups in mind, but how it came out really missed the mark. So I'm just really interested in learning more about that, and maybe if other folks want to discuss that here or some other time.
Sam, did you want to say anything?
Well, it leads into the next conversation. So if you folks want to discuss it, it will be part of what I'll kick off with in a bit.
Yeah. So unless there are any other comments, we're running a few minutes ahead of schedule. And so, which is okay, obviously, but I don't necessarily, but so I would like to ask, do folks want to just take a 5-minute break now, or do you want to wait until 7 o'clock and do it? Or do you want to do it now and then kind of plow through until 8? Randy, you have an opinion?
I think we should just keep going and.
Okay. So, that was that part. We're going to skip so I'm going to actually change. I'm going to stop sharing for just a moment. And the next part of the meeting, we're going to screen share a document that is a sort of working Word document. And it's the same document. It is the document that we brought to this sort of small group work session where we asked the BIPOC-led organizations that provided the most detailed feedback to kind of work through some of the changes that we were thinking about to make sure that we fully understood what their kind of the critique in their comments and that we were so that we were addressing the right problem. We wanted to make sure that we were addressing the right problem. And so the way that the document is organized is essentially for each of the sections of the scoring criteria, so organizational capacity, project description and scope, environmental benefit. For all of those, we go over what changes we have recommended making in the applications, and then what the new application questions for that section look like, and then what changes we are recommending to make in the scoring criteria for that section, and then what the new scoring criteria for that section looks like. And we will definitely not get through the whole document tonight. So but what's nice is that we did have this initial meeting with those organizations to make sure that we kind of like fully understood their concerns, and we walked through this document with them. So we can also bring you some of the feedback that we got from them on some of the changes that we recommended. So I'm gonna dig that up, but I wanted to turn it over to Sam first and ask him to talk a little bit just about the sort of changes made related to racial and social justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yeah, so I think that I want to acknowledge that that was a question that we as staff also wrestled with for quite a bit. I think that those set of questions, when we went out for it, we knew that we didn't get it right. It was a consistent placeholder, and we in our internal documents had a highlight on that, like we've got to keep working this, and we didn't, and we acknowledged that we needed to put it out and hear folks' feedback, and so that's exactly what we heard. I think what you'll see here, and what Katie will bring up as we go through the document, is we reflected quite a bit on that and how we could address it, and ultimately what we are recommending is we actually remove the questions asking about how organizations prioritizes racial and social justice, diversity, equity, inclusion in their programs and services, as well as internal operations. And I want you to sit with that for a second, and I'm going to reflect on the changes we made and how we think because what that did in that process is those questions were certainly geared, and we had in our mind that white-led organizations would be applying, and we wanted to see exactly how they were doing on those elements. I don't want to say it was exclusively that, but that certainly was part of the mindset. And as we thought and connected with a lot of these BIPOC-led organizations, the reflection was that whether for resource reasons or historically that, as foundations and others have pushed groups to do this work, that hasn't been the ask that has come to them. And so they necessarily haven't been resourced to develop those sorts of plans and others. And so it just isn't, and nor is it, when we talk to many organizations, if you look at their mission statements and others, they actually don't talk about even serving, whether it's Black youth or others, just because of the way racism has shown up often and the way that they've had to code and speak to their work. So what we leaned on instead, and some of the big changes, and you'll see this as we collectively go through the organizational capacity section, is what we said is what really matters when we're talking about what are we really trying to get at when we're asking these questions about racial and social justice and how an organization practices its work and how it does it, do it internally. What are we trying to get at? And inherently from an outcomes perspective, the way that that shows up is certainly a board's makeup. It shows up in leadership. It shows up in their staff. It shows up in their priority populations. It shows up how they serve their priority populations. It shows up how they do their organizing. And so it was a question of how does it show up for an organization in terms of an outcomes? How does it show up in terms of the work that they actually do? Because that is part of that question, so the work they're doing. So and so we asked, so that's really, so we had a lot of those other questions in there. And so what we decided to do was place a lot more weight on the organization's makeup, the priority populations they serve, and how they do their organizing. So that's a lot of what we ultimately decided to do is shift the burden of weight, but certainly place a lot more weight in those other areas. And as Katie walks through, generally speaking, the folks we've connected with were receptive to exactly that. And so we'll walk through and talk through exactly how the questions show up, but that was one of the big changes. I think that as we reflect now and we think about who we're now, as we're further centering this process around BIPOC-led, majority BIPOC-led organizations and organizations that are led by those that they serve, it's one thing that I think we're going to have to hold in our mind as we're going out with 8 million. It's going to be something else we're going to have to rethink about as we see what comes out in this cycle and as we gear up for the 40 million. So just realities of think what we're faced with now and who we center now and how we're going to have to reflect on the outcomes we come out and get out of this process and what it means as we retool this and go out for the 40 million. So, but that was one of the key changes. And with that, I'll turn it over to Katie because you'll see exactly how that manifests in the questions and the scoring.
Okay. So can everybody see the document that I just shared, and is it big enough to read? Is that?
Katie, I'm wondering if you can push up that tab at the top, like get rid of the bar from the right corner. This little arrow, yeah.
Can you also zoom in? So maybe a section at a time.
Is that a little better?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So does that seems good for most folks? Okay. So this is the organizational capacity section. And this was a section where we got a lot of comments. So Sam just kind of gave you guys a little bit of some context around the really significant, some of the more significant changes, but just to kind of reiterate and kind of detail exactly where they were. And I guess maybe before I start, I would also note that there were a few sort of like tweaky things, and those are not noted here. So just because they're not really substantive. But so the first change was that we removed the request for the mission statement. The second, we removed a question asking to describe how the organization prioritizes racial and social justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Those are the questions that Sam was just talking about. And there were two of them. There was one that spoke to a program's sort of service delivery and like their outward facing selves. And then there was another question that spoke more to their like internal work. And both of those have been removed. We added a question for the organization to briefly describe their approach and experience with community organizing, outreach, and/or stakeholder engagement. One of the questions, there's a lot of feedback about the level of detail that was requested related to outreach and engagement. And then also, I think because of some of the examples that showed up in the scoring criteria, there was kind of the perception that the program was trying to be really prescriptive and say, this is the only way to do good outreach and engagement. And so we made some changes to kind of add more flexibility and just make it really clear that that was not what we were trying to do. We adjusted the table that assesses how the organization reflects the community that the project will serve to better characterize reflecting the lived experience of people who are low income and chronically underemployed. So that was it was a tweak, but it was one that came up a lot, which is how it ended up on this list, because folks weren't sure how to say what % of their staff or board kind of were low income, and there was a lot of confusion around that. So now there's sort of a narrative answer to how they to sort of reflecting the lived experience of people who are low income or chronically underemployed. We simplified the request for financial statements. This was another one where we had a number of examples, and we didn't, and that kind of ended up feeling like we were asking for a whole lot. And so we simplified that request, and we actually removed one question from that section, which was the question about the financial reserves of the organization. And so everything that is removed is, of course, removed from the scoring criteria. So we'll get to that. You'll see how that shows up a little bit later on. I will say that there were some things that we didn't do. I mean, there were some things that we changes that we did make, and there were things that were requested that we didn't make those, that we haven't made those changes, that we feel there's sort of good rationale for keeping some of that stuff in. So I just also wanted to point out, before we get into what the sort of new questions look like for this section, that I kind of just tried to add up this level of effort guidance, which is for each of the questions that provides a narrative response, we in parentheses said, you know, like, we think this would be roughly 75 words to 150 words or something like that. We definitely need to be clear with folks that those are not hard those are not like hard parameters. If people can say it with less, or they need more to say it, there's not going to be any sort of caps on that, but we did want to make sure that people had like a general sense of the level of effort there. And so for the new sort of, for this section, if you add all of the questions together, the level of effort, according to our guidance, is about 1 to 2 pages, plus 2 tables, and then submitting financial documents. Are there any questions about anything that I've kind of gone over so far, the application changes? Jeffrey?
Yeah, I want to get into number 2, the remove questions about asking to describe how organizations prioritize racial and social justice. What was the feedback you guys got on that made you guys decide to remove that section of it? Because that seems to be part of what we're trying to do. So I'm just curious what their feedback was on that.
Well, so Sam, did you want to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I think at a high level, the feedback was really supportive of that, in part because we balanced that with increasing the weight on what the organizational makeup looked like and placing a lot of weight there. So ultimately, we're placing a lot of trust that if you reflect the community you serve, that and we acknowledge, I think, in our internal conversations, we know that that isn't everything. But as far as simplifying the application, that was one place where if you reflect the community you serve, then that is one place where it should manifest in terms of that is how your racial equity should show up in your program delivery. You should reflect the community you serve, as well as and then there's a couple other places in terms of, there's this, you know, when we add this question about racial, social justice, equity, inclusion, it was about in your programs and services. And so we do have this question 02 now, and the question existed before, we just separated them out a little differently, but we are asking for organizations to describe their records serving PCEF priority populations, how long they've been focused on those populations, and what percentage of the organization's work this represents. So that sort of captured, really, that at least captured how, that boiled it down in a more simple way around whether they are focused on, you know, POC communities, low-income communities, folks with disabilities, others. So it was more, as we were simplifying and centering BIPOC-led organizations, they felt that those questions, those questions more appropriately spoke to what they did do, and they could answer those questions. Whereas asking about diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, it felt more like those, in that framing, it was geared more towards white-led organizations who may have resources, develop the right statements and all that, but may not necessarily internally do the work in the same way. So so I don't want to acknowledge that it's that in losing that question, we were perfectly replacing it, but that was sort of the balance and trade-off that we were negotiating. And the groups were supportive of that.
I actually agree with that. That makes complete sense. I didn't see, we haven't obviously got to that section yet, but that's more clear. I think it's more reflective of what we're trying to do. So
Yeah, that's helpful for me too.
Shanice?
Yeah, this is a good conversation, and it's making me think about the comments that were raised around how it might appear just who this might be for, the unintended impacts. A white organization answering this question, how they might prioritize racial justice. But if this funds are going to the folks who they need to, who they need to be going to, I think there's definitely a different way of going about what we're looking for sure. And I also wanted to comment, because I think this is related, the next one, number 3. I do believe that there is space to recognize, and it brings up, there's a few things going on, I guess, but the space where we have organizations talk or articulate the kind of community support that they have generally. And I think the PCEF Coalition in itself is that. So if you're hearing what I'm saying, I think there's a way for folks to fill out an application regardless of what it says, and it looks good. But this question about community organizing and outreach is just such a broad question. But I think what we want to be hearing, I think what we're looking for is, are the beneficiaries that we're looking for the funds, are they messing with y'all? Are they engaged with y'all? They're just talking a little bit about that. And so I know organizations inherently are engaged in this work with the PCEF Coalition, in addition to maybe the folks who we might imagine are saying the beneficiaries of these funds and the organization's position to support them, that they might inherently have that kind of programming to talk about. So maybe it's less about the broad stuff, and actually let's see an example of like the that work that might validate, or where a white organization can't say, I mean, just calling it out, we're in an uprising, whatever. These things happen, right, during processes like these, especially as I reflect on all of the other systems. It's easy to do this work if you're positioned to do it, right? You got the staff and you can talk in a broad sense about it. So I just want to chew on that, I guess, number 3, and maybe it's more about the exemplar program, if you will, that could be the PCEF Coalition. I'm seeing that as the getting at what this is getting at. Does that make sense for folks? But I think the white audience, it's hard, and I do it myself, working serving people of color, right? Creating spaces and systems that ultimately work really great for white audiences. But what is the different thing we want to build in this moment? And I think the questions y'all are raising are good ones, and so they're connected.
Thank you, Shanice. Memphis, did you have a question? Your hand was up, but now it is down. No. Okay. So I was reminded by my colleagues that this is to make sure to reiterate that this is all draft. I mean, part of the reason that we didn't send this out ahead of time is that it really is a working document, and so as we're having work sessions with the nonprofits that we've convened, and as we're getting more input from you, things are going to be changed. So this is draft, but sort of. Just wanted to kind of reiterate that. So now I think we can start going through some we can go through the new draft questions for the organizational capacity section. I do also note, though, that because of the shift in emphasis to making sure that we award funds to the right organizations, we are recommending that we put a couple more points into the organizational capacity section. And so we're recommending that go from worth 13 out of 100 to worth 15 out of 100. And those points were taken from the budget section. So for what that's worth, that's kind of the recommendation that we're thinking about right now. So I just want to go through these questions, and there are not a ton of them. And Maria got kicked out, but is coming back in now. But I would ask you guys if there is something that feels confusing or you have a question, to raise your hand, and maybe we can just get through the whole section so you can kind of see it as a whole, and then we can go back and I'd like to kind of get your feedback on what you think about each of those questions. So the first is to provide a statement of the organization's purpose and describe how that purpose supports the goals of PCEF. I would note that one of the things one of the questions we sort of knew would get asked when we wrote this was, point us to the document that has the list of PCEF goals. And so I do think that we will need to be, we recognize that we're going to need to be really clear about kind of what we mean when we say that, because we've been using that language kind of broadly to mean the goals that are in the code, the goals the sort of guiding principles that the committee has adopted, and we might need to bring a little bit more clarity to that if we're going to ask people to speak to it. The second is describe your organization's record serving PCEF priority populations, include which populations you serve, how long your organization has been focused on the population, and what % of the organization's work this represents. If applicable, include any supporting documents noted in your explanation. And so I will, and I would just note that some of the feedback that we got from the group of nonprofits that we convened and talked with yesterday was that this felt like somewhere we might actually think about putting more weight, because it speaks to the history of working with priority populations rather than the history of doing energy efficiency projects or installing solar panels or doing those sorts of things. That was sort of like the critical value add that providing funding to these kinds of organizations provides to the climate movement and to the work that they're doing. The third one is just a checklist for applicants with more than 5 full-time year-round employees. Which benefits does your organization provide to its full-time year-round employees? And so this is different. The last draft of the application had a question about what benefits were provided to employees just for everyone, and you could only get full points if you provided health insurance benefits plus one of something else on the list. And we got a lot of feedback that was really prohibitive for very small nonprofit organizations. And so we have this question, but the question only applies to organizations that have 5 or more full-time year-round employees. And that was met with lukewarm response do you think that is fair, Sam? Lukewarm, yeah. There was still a little bit of concern, but it generally felt maybe okay. Robin?
Yeah, if an organization has less than 5 full-time, they would skip this question. Would they get dinged point-wise?
No. The points would just be redistributed, yeah. Rainpeace?
Describe the purpose of this question again. Like what's the aim that we're trying to do here for this question? Whether it's an energy efficiency project that perhaps a contractor does, or work the nonprofit does itself. Like I guess trying to get back to like the larger picture here. What's the question that we're trying to ask here? What's the purpose, and what yeah, what's the purpose that it's supposed to serve?
Yeah. So I think that part of this has to do with, part of it was in response to the idea that there's a lot of emphasis on providing benefit to the contractor community and to folks who are working on these projects in the trades. And and there are points associated with that. And there's a lot of questions associated with that, but there's another set of workers. There's another piece of the workforce that are not in the trades, and they're not contractors. They're actually just employees of the nonprofits. And so wanting to reward, kind of create an incentive for those workers to also have access to health insurance benefits and, you know, paid time off and retirement. Do you remember that, sort of those conversations?
Yeah, I do. I think one thing maybe just to highlight, as different stakeholders are hearing about this key component, you know, I think just understanding, and I think even for us, I think it's the pitfall of trying to do it all in one application.
Mm-hmm.
That, you know, we have different projects, you know, projects that it's probably a contractor's going to do the work, maybe a project that's going to be funded, that's the nonprofit doing the work. But trying to do it all in one application, it's sending different signals. So like me personally as a committee member here, you know, this standard, this question or applicants being scored where 100% of the work's going to be done by a contractor doesn't make a lot of sense if it's a work that's being done in-house by a nonprofit. Personally, I think it does make sense, but you know, like if it's, but at the same time, like part of my challenge when I hear this question too is knowing that a lot of groups are already completely underfunded. And so to me, it's also, you know, I kind of wonder if organizations' responses change to this question, to this standard, if it's framed like, you know, if you were to be funded, what are the types of benefits you would be able to provide to your staff? To me, that's like two different types of question. One is, I think, you know, reaching more towards a more well-resourced system where, you know, if we could provide for more for our staff, what would we be able to provide versus what are you providing now? And then we'll score you based on that. You know, I think I just wanted to highlight that because I think I just see I could see sort of some of the potential challenges that's as our current application is framed and constructed.
Yeah, I think that's a tricky one with so for organizations, if you were a very small nonprofit and 100% of your funding was going to come from PCEF, then I think you could answer like, you know, you could build that into your budget, maybe the benefits for the employees into your budgets, but might be more of a challenge if PCEF was just a piece of your funding or a project that you were going to do that had sort of a limited term. But I think that, yeah, that is good feedback. So are there any other comments on that benefits question? I will say that the group that we did convene, although it did not include any very, very, very small, I think fewer than 5, Sam, correct me if I'm wrong.
I think some folks brought perspective that came from very small organizations. Okay. And keep going, and
they seem to feel like this was maybe okay. And particularly because to receive full points, it's not like you don't have to have a 401k or a pension or a retirement. You just have to have health insurance benefits plus one other thing. So PTO, yeah. Or it might be worth doing a little bit more outreach to some, yeah, in that like 5 range.
Yeah, when we added that clarification that it was really the full points was health insurance plus one of those other things, that did make it more palatable. And I do want to argue that at least one of the respondents there thought it sent a proper signal. It gave their organization, when they've applied to grants, it gave them the ability to make the case for their organization to start investing in it. So there was that point was made too around the signal that it does send. But
yeah, that's true.
Just to start clarifying, paid time off, isn't that required by law or by city ordinance? Or
There's a state law around this. I don't exactly know. So I know paid sick leave. There's paid sick leave is a state law. I don't know if paid time off is actually.
There's sick
I've
leave.
been saying this, I'm realizing.
Sorry, but this is my ignorance that paid sick leave falls under paid time off.
Robin, did you have insight into that?
No, I was just clarifying. It is the laws that are around paid sick leave.
Okay.
Which is different from paid time off, which is presumably holiday or vacation time.
Okay.
It also only applies for 10 or more staff for an organization.
Oh, okay. Look at all this legal expertise in the room. I wanted to touch base because we blew past our potential break and we're at 7:16. So do you all feel like a 4-minute break would be useful right now? Let's do a 2-minute break. Let's do a 2-minute break. Okay, so we're going to be back here at 7:18. Oh, okay. So then number 5, oh, Shanice?
Oh, oops, I didn't know if we were waiting till the end for questions, but it is relevant to that.
Yeah, no,
I think I'm curious, especially reflecting on my earlier comment around what we might be wanting to see versus, grappling with the nature of how the questions are needing to look. I'm curious about what it looks like as we think about our values or principles. Is there a connection to it that we can make with that outreach question? One of them, and it's going to take me to go back intentionally to maybe populate one to recommend, but I'm resonating with this connection to how that outreach ultimately impacts that, and I think that might be more interesting to hear, and maybe it's more words, but
yeah.
I think there's a chance that when we get to the scoring criteria, there is more specificity in the scoring criteria around what gets full points, what kind of outreach and engagement are you doing to get full points? So it isn't just general outreach. I mean, so we may be able to get there, but I almost want, Shanice, what I guess I'm calling is when we get to the scoring criteria, I want to make sure that when you see that, take a look at that and see if that might get there at a different place.
Yeah. Robin, do you retract your question? Okay. I did also, I think that this is, before we move on, just wanted to kind of mention that because I think it will be important in how all of these things that have been made a little bit more flexible are evaluated, just to mention kind of the makeup of the scoring panels, and kind of as we're thinking about putting scoring panels together, being intentional about making sure that that the majority of the people who are on each scoring panel are people of color, that there's gender balance within the scoring panels. And so that we are actually kind of bringing multiple perspectives and bringing the perspectives of communities of color to the sort of answers that we're receiving in the applications. So just wanted to make sure that was kind of in folks' heads, because there is some more subjectivity in the scoring now, for sure. So question 5 is kind of the lead in to the table, where folks tell us what % of their staff leadership and their board are members of communities that the project is intended to serve. And this is only for projects that are targeting PCEF priority populations. If there are projects, and again, this is draft, but the idea is that if there are projects that are just like, it's a general community project, you wouldn't be able to get points for having a board and staff that reflected the general community. It really is for projects that target the priority populations and organizations that have staff and board and leadership that reflect those priority populations. I do also want to kind of call out that we do note that the table below only lists the demographic characteristics that are priority populations called out in the PCEF code. We know that the table is not comprehensive and that people may have additional identities not identified or included here. And so, and I also just want to put out there that we do think that there will be some additional tweaks that need to happen to the table and potentially the questions surrounding the table to make sure that the scoring panel has enough information to really be able to tell if an organization is reflecting the community that they intend to serve. But we do believe that we understand the intent that has that the intent of this table is understood by the nonprofits, the BIPOC-led nonprofits that we have been talking with, and that there is a sort of strong endorsement to move in this direction. Sam, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I mean, just overall, even through the public comment period, this was an area that, particularly when we connect with BIPOC-led organizations, there was strong support for this approach.
Yeah. And so I mostly just mentioned the tweaking because I mean, as staff, we can get really wrapped around the axle thinking about, well, what about this kind of thing? What about this? And how do we do that? So I don't think that we necessarily just know that we are doing that. And we're working with other folks in doing that to get kind of as accurate a picture as possible. And then there is this one additional question where we took low income and people who are with low incomes or who are chronically unemployed or underemployed out of the table and just asked for the organization to speak to how their staff leadership and board reflected that organization and to estimate sort of the percentages within those two. The last few questions in the organizational capacity section are the financials. And we just really simplified question 7, and it now is just describe how your organization will manage and account for spending of grant funds. And so before we did have a lot of examples in there. I think that this is the question we were always intending to ask, but but because sometimes when we would talk to people, they would be like, well, tell us what you mean. And so we had a lot of examples in there. And I think people really felt like they would be required to have all of those, to have all of that documentation. And then we're asking for folks to submit their current board approved operating budget and the most recent 3 years of financial statements. If they have audited financial statements, we're asking for those to be submitted, but we're not requiring that an organization have audited financials. And then there is this, just the table with sort of total revenue and expenses and the surplus and deficit. And then kind of a prompt to give us some narrative. If there's things that look weird in their financials, then they have an opportunity to kind of tell us, explain a little bit more of what's going on. I will say that we got some feedback that a table like this might not make sense for affordable housing providers. And so we will be doing a little bit of follow-up just to make sure that they can characterize their financials in a way that makes sense for their industry. So that's the end of the draft application, new draft application questions for the organizational capacity. As Sam noted at the beginning, the most substantial change is removing those questions about those questions about racial and social justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and shifting that weight onto the organization reflecting the community that they serve and having a track record of having served PCEF priority populations. Any thoughts or comments? Okay.
Robin.
Yeah, I know these are questions. And we haven't seen the criteria. Is there a criteria or screen, whatever you want to call it, that might address the scenario where, let's say, a nonprofit had a $100,000 operating budget and is now asking for a $5 million grant? Is that type of kind of screening or criteria built into the scoring criteria?
No.
Should it be? And I guess where I'm coming from is you know, I know a lot of organizations are viewing this, you know, as a great opportunity, and it is, but I'm also concerned that, you know, some organizations might be biting off more than they can chew. And you know, we don't have to discuss that here, but you know, that is a concern of mine.
I think it's a fair point. Sam, did you want to say something?
I think Robin, I guess I would ask that you hold and keep that thought and think through that as we get through the project scope section, because we do talk about the project team there. And certainly the way that we have pivoted as we get to the points, what you'll see is the way we've pivoted this and the way we ask about this, which will connect to actually the project scope section. And because there are questions we've removed there, you'll see that it may make more sense to have a BIPOC-led organization be as the primary applicant in order to get those points in the first section. So what we're doing is we're incentivizing them being in the driver's seat of this. What it also does, though, is that, you know, we'll also have to be able to look at the collection of the team in terms of being able to implement this, but it means that our relationship as a city would be with that organization, they'd be in the driver's seat. So we do have to wrestle with that, and I think that is where we come back to what does it mean as program staff to support those grantees as we manage those projects. So it's not a perfect answer, but I think that's just to acknowledge that there's many elements that are going to have to come together. And I think I would continue asking that question as you get to the project scope, the end of the project scope section, and thinking whether you could, you know, you'd see a smaller organization that hasn't necessarily managed a project budget of that size, but whether the team makes that up and whether, you know, in balance, you know, obviously we would be our team would be supporting them what that could look like. So.
Yeah, I think that, and we're not going to get to that section today, but Sam does make a really good point that there is sort of the team experience and qualifications section would, if we were looking at an organization that just had a $100,000 operating budget and they were looking to do a $5 million project, they would need to have assembled or have a plan to assemble a team that had the capacity to do that kind of work. And I will just share that I have, in my professional experience, have worked with a number of very, very small organizations that have successfully implemented multi-million-dollar projects, and because they had a good team and contractor, and because they were able to access some support from the funding organization to make sure that they were kind of understood all of the pieces of the puzzle and to help with the kind of contractor relationship. So I think it does require sometimes may require more kind of staff and program assistance, but I have certainly seen it be successful. I guess I just would put that out there.
Okay, I'll hold my thought. Thank you.
Yeah, no, and it won't be tonight that we get to that section.
I'm going to forget then.
Oh, right.
We will
write
remind
ourselves
you.
a note about it. We'll remind you. Yeah. So we're at 7:33 right now. We are going to shift in about 7 minutes because this is, and then we're going to pick this document back up where we left off. And so I wonder, I think that what might be helpful is just to kind of go over the scoring changes, and then we can begin to go through the scoring criteria. but we are going to have a fairly hard stop at 7:40 because we have a few other things that we need to get done before 8 o'clock. So the scoring criteria, again, associated with the organizational capacity section. The changes to that section are that we increased the points from 13 to 15 out of 100, removed points for stated mission of serving PCEF priority populations, removed the points for demonstrating commitment to racial and social justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion in programs and services, as well as in internal operations. Sort of, as we've mentioned a few times, shifted focus on points for community engagement to include community organizing, outreach, and/or stakeholder engagement, specifically with historically marginalized communities. We have more points assigned to organization reflecting the community the project is intended to serve. And we have removed points for providing health insurance and other benefits for organizations with fewer than 5 full-time year-round employees, and removed points for history of successful grant execution. So there are, let me just count, there are 5 kind of opportunities to earn points in this section. The first is that the organization has the track record of delivering programs that benefit economically disadvantaged community members, including people of color, women, people with disabilities, and/or the chronically underemployed. One of the changes that we made here was just to make it a little bit more clear that the organization really, that has to be their primary focus. I think that with many nonprofits, it would be easy for them to say that they do this because it's such an expansive list, and it includes low income, and it includes, you know, just, you could almost anyone could answer yes to this question. So to receive full points, the applicant organization has to have had at least 3 years of delivering programs that benefit communities identified in this criteria, and they have to have a primary organizational focus on those populations. It still might not screen out a large number of organizations that have been around for 3 years. I would note that. Any thoughts on that one? The second one is that the organization demonstrates a strong understanding and practice around community organizing and/or stakeholder engagement, particularly focused on historically marginalized and culturally diverse communities. And to receive full points there, the engagement reflects an understanding of the historically marginalized community or communities that they serve, that the engagement activities are informed by principles of inclusion, co-creation, and collaboration.
And so what we did here is we broadened the language around the criteria from on the criteria end so that folks could see themselves as it was originally community engagement, but we broadened it. And we also removed the examples from what the criteria to receive full points, because those examples felt like folks had to provide exactly that. So we broadened that. So this is one of those areas, the scoring panel is going to be important. So now, Shanice, this was one of the areas that I wanted you to sit with this as you thought about the previous question, the way that it was asked, and just see if that brings anything up for you.
Also recognizing that we can certainly return to these. I mean, this is the first time that you're seeing these, and so we know, you know, we're not kind of expecting folks to have fully baked or digested. Andrea?
Yeah, I was kind of thinking this through in the question, and now here, especially with the addition of engagement activities are informed, blah, blah, blah. From my perspective, community organizing includes leadership development, but it doesn't necessarily imply enough community leadership to me. And because it's and/or, I wonder if, for me, I think it might be helpful to say community organizing, community leadership, and or stakeholder engagement. Like outreach and engagement and organizing can all be passive recipients. And I think we're looking for more community-led efforts.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that. The next one is worth 5 points. So a third of all of the points for this section. And that is that the staff, including leadership and board of the organization, reflect the community the proposed project is intended to serve. And to get full points for that, the majority, including leadership of staff and the majority of the board of directors, have to reflect the community the project is intended to serve. And then there's kind of a little bit more of an explanation about what that means if you're talking about low income population or chronically underemployed people who are not also people of color or people with disabilities or women. This is just the one about benefits. And I think we've already talked about, like, you know, how you get full points. And the footnote here is that it only applies to organizations with 5 or more employees. Those 2 points then get sort of evenly reallocated or based on the relative weights of the other scoring criteria. And then the last one in this section is that the application demonstrates the ability to manage funds responsibly and effectively. And to get full points here, the revenues are not less than expenditures. And the qualifier there, which is underlined to make sure that is very, very clear, is that, that revenues are not less than expenditures without having provided a reasonable explanation. That there are no audit findings of a material weakness in the past 3 years when audited financials are available. That won't apply to folks who don't have audited financials. And that there are strong internal budget management practices and controls. There are still some examples in here that may or may not be useful. We are still wrestling with how to provide guidance without appearing to be listing requirements. So I think that that is something that, you know, as Sam has mentioned, we are kind of talking about internally, but also seeking the guidance of professional communicators and folks who are work in BIPOC-led nonprofit organizations to kind of make sure that we provide enough, but not too much. And the documentation there just includes, again, those 3 years, if available, of audited financials, if available, and the current year-to-date financial statements. And that's worth 3 points. So I think that one thing to note, and now we're 2 minutes over, so I'm just going to bring us another 30 seconds over. One thing to really note about this section is that an applicant who is coming from a BIPOC-led organization that has a staff and board that reflects the community their project intends to serve is in a position to be able to get, you know, kind of, I think if you add them up, like 7 to 10 points, that would be really difficult for a sort of more mainstream white-led organization to get. And that is because like we talked about, they're of the sort of recognizing the value add to the sort of projects and programs of having communities served by members of their own communities.
And you'll see those are additive with other sections in terms of the focus on priority populations. So there are 10 there, but you'll see in subsequent sections that at least the focus, in addition to that leadership, the focus on priority populations will continue to add additional points as we continue through this.
Yep. So at our next meeting, we're gonna, we might revisit this section and just ask for some kind of like thoughts, and if you guys have any thoughts in between now and then, but then we will keep moving on through it, through the other sections. And so, Robin?
Yeah.
We're going to turn it
Quick,
over
just
to
quick,
Sam.
is there something you can share with us? Because I'm not going to remember this detail.
Yes, I think that we can probably share. So we'll reconvene as staff and kind of figure that out.
Yeah, we'll there's a few tweaks we may need to make, and then we'll share what we've gone through today here, so you have that at least in front of you, and you can simmer and think about that.
Thanks.
Okay.
Okay.
So Sam, you're up.
Yeah, so I just wanted to, before we pivot on and send this on, as we move forward, I just wanted to, a quick just kind of grounding for us. You know, originally as we shifted out and added a week to the public comment period, we pushed out the RFP release to August, from August 3rd to August 10th. And I think with some of the changes that we're aiming to make here, we're going to push out another couple of weeks, but we think we're still aiming to get out the RFP in August, and that's been something we've been consistently communicating here. So our hope, and our plan is to continue workshopping the critical feedback and our thoughts on addressing them with the cohort of majority BIPOC-led nonprofits. And we think this path will, as just the feedback we're getting, will allow us to meaningfully address these. But in order to do this, hear your thoughts. We'd love to hear your thoughts, I guess, on extending our meeting next week for another hour, so that we can meet for 3 hours to go through and cover more content. And just love to hear any other thoughts you have. And then, so just wanted, we've heard a few things, but I wanted to share that, ask for an additional hour from you all, and see if you have any thoughts, and then we can pivot over to our next section. Okay. Silence is affirmative then. Is that it? Does that work for folks? We'll go for 6 to 9 potentially, and we will cut you out short if we get through as much content as we're hoping to. There is a good chunk of content that continuity will be helpful. Okay. All right. Well, then with that, I think this next piece here is a continuation of the conversation we had on the 24th. That Ramfis brought up, and I just want to pivot over here for Ramfis to lead this next part of the discussion before we close out the meeting.
Yeah, thanks, Sam, and again, thanks to the PCEF team for the meeting today and all the work going around community engagement. To switch gears, thanks for allowing me to bring forth a letter drafted by a coalition led by Oregon Tradeswomen and Constructing Hope around a racist incident that occurred at a construction site in downtown Portland, where some of the public owners include the city of Portland and OHSU, among others. And I think, as we heard from some of our community members who work in the industry, a hostile work environment isn't a new theme, and I think unfortunately the types and forms of overt racism that we're seeing more and more here in the mainstream, I think calls the attention for us as a committee to respond. And I think one of our challenges as a PCEF committee will be trying to create career pathways for women and people of color and other impacted communities into clean energy jobs. And I think one of the biggest barriers that will circumvent that effort is a hostile work environment. And so I wanted to propose at least starting a draft of a letter that folks here in the committee will be able to respond. And I want to honor everyone who actually has real experience inside the industry and outside of the industry to be able to weigh in. What I wanted to promote as a framework for a letter is calling, one, the importance for why we as a committee would respond to an incident like this and be public about it. Two, calling out PCEF's mission and our guiding principles. Three, call attention to asking for site-specific changes and improvements on the site. But more importantly, calling into attention just the overall industry-wide reform that we need to make sure to protect a system that moves away from protecting well, I think that moves towards protecting women and people of color, especially Black women and Black workers on construction sites. And I think as a committee that's valued and said we were going to be BIPOC specific, I think we should just be very specific in our language on that. So I wanted to propose that as a framework, but I wanted everyone's fingerprints on this letter, and I just want to recognize the breadth of experience both inside and outside of the industry, and I just want this to be a unified voice from the committee. But I wanted to hear feedback about that, but it would allow everyone for an opportunity to review it and see it again and revisit this in our next PCEF committee. Shanice, I see your hand up. I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, I'll keep it quick, especially since we're short and I want to leave some space for others. I just want to say I resonate with this strongly, and it's definitely, I think, within our role to think about how Black people are failed, Black workers are failed in these environments, and as you know, people about to grant money to maybe reinforce some of that. Not only do we have a role in calling it out, but also recognizing what that will mean for the industry to do that. And also comments from Michael, I know he's not here, and Jeffrey last week was really striking me at our last meeting, especially this notion that, yeah, this happened, but this is an ongoing, this is just the day-to-day expectation. And so how do we not reinforce that? It's like people's lives are on the line. So I almost think, you know, we ought to do it.
Jeffrey?
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing this up, Ramses. This is very important. I 100% agree with you, and I'm glad that you're taking up, you're presenting this to the group. As I said last time, you know, this is not new in industry. This is very prevalent in industry, and the only way it's going to change is if we do speak out, and it has to be a unified front, and it has to be all our voices, you know, saying this. And I think what the Black Lives Matters movement has been showing us, and recent events have been showing us, is that when we do unify our voice, things do change. So, you know, not saying anything to me is doing everybody a disservice.
Robin?
Yeah, is there a in the statement, is there an element of holding the prime accountable for you know, these incidents?
There were demands, right? Oh, so go ahead, Ron, please.
Oh no, you go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah.
I actually think some of those demands could be really interesting for us to sit with, and maybe that could be a follow-up space then, on which I'm not sure the appropriate format virtually makes it all interesting. But I think sitting with those demands, because there are some very tangible steps, but in the context of our work, how we can think about that, and also maybe connect with these folks. Those are some things I'm thinking of. And I'm just gonna need to go and take a look at this letter.
I think you're right on that one, Cheese, and I think to your question there, Robin, I think there will include an element on that. I do want to make sure that multiple stakeholders share some ownership or responsibility, whether it's the owners of the projects, the subcontractor involved. But again, I think it's just highlighting if it's an industry-wide problem, it's everyone's problem, and I think that's just my hope with the tone of the letter. But again, I think this will be reviewed by everyone here in the committee, so I just want to make sure we set the right tone for what we're trying to convey here as a letter together.
And just to add real quick, I also think it sets a tone to shows contractors that are going to be trying to apply to what we're trying to do here, that this will not be tolerated. You know, so it sets the right tone for people that we want to actually be applying to the monies that we're going to be coming into here shortly. So I think it's a very good time to do something like this of this nature.
Maria?
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing this to this space because it's relevant and it's urgent for us to continue talking about repercussions and consequences and how we can address this straightforward. There are also other incidents that are not as visual and big and shocking as this that I think we also should call attention to. You know, like all of the paper cuts that happen every day to Black, Indigenous, and people of color in all of these spaces. And I think those could be amplified too as we find examples to bring forward. So thank you for always looking out for that and for this group to make room to think this through and to speak out. This is the forum for it. And I hope people know that we can inform people and we can also take action together as a community.
Thanks, Maria. Any other thoughts? So just to clarify, Sam, did you want to sort of speak to the process to get from there?
Yeah. So what we've done, and I know, I mean, Ramses, I know we've connected before. What we've done is we've taken some notes here, and I mean, high level about connecting. You know, this would be a letter from the committee to the. Given your role, it would be a letter from the committee to City Council, but we would figure out how to make sure it's more broadly known. We would. What I've taken as notes here that I'm going to repeat shortly here, but what we'll do is staff will take a first go at taking this and pulling this together in some sort of form and share that. I think Ramses, my hope is to share that with you so that you can, given that I think you're closest to this, and if you all agree with that. So I'll walk through the comments. We'll pull it into some sort of letter, and then we'll work with Ramses in order to tighten that up to present it to you all as a full committee in next week's meeting, next Wednesday's meeting. And so some of the points that I've got here is speaking to the relevance of why it's important that this committee speaks out on this and connecting it to the PCEF mission, the goals. Speaking to site-specific changes and improvements that are going to be needed. So directly speaking to that site, calling into attention the industry-wide reforms that need to happen to protect women, people of color, and certainly women of color. In setting the tone that this will not be, that as we move forward, we will be seeking to address these issues in PCEF head on, and that this will not be tolerated on PCEF projects. I think that's, I mean, there's a few other notes that I have, but that's at a high level. Those are the themes that I've captured, and I want to just make sure if there are other themes that you want to capture in this, that we'll at least take a first go at pulling that together and sharing that with Ramses and then bringing that back to you all next week.
I would offer that we are here kind of thinking about, Maria had her hand raised. Maybe let me pause.
Yeah, you can go ahead and finish, Anise.
Now I'm like, oh, kind of thrown up. I think that it would be valuable to hold some space where we call out Black lives, say Black Lives Matter. I know we're working towards this collective impact, right? When centering Black and Indigenous and folks of color. And in this moment, I think, we're talking about nooses and Black folks dying, and we are able to even have this conversation amongst each other in this way. And I think that being explicit about that in this letter is going to be important. The impact will be important.
Maria?
Yeah, I echo what Shani said. I think that's exactly something we should add. And I know I had some past comments too, not directly related to this, but when it comes to helping amplify the needs and the types of justice we need to bring forward to groups. Black Lives Matter, absolutely, and even our undocumented community. I don't often see them called out in our work and in the language of the policy and whatnot, but I know there's other ways we can stand in solidarity with our immigrant undocumented community in the work that we do. And it doesn't have to be through a letter like this because it's a different issue, but I hope we can continue to uplift the types of injustices that happen and bring forward some kind of solution and solidarity in our industry when needed.
Thanks, Maria. So we have about 1 minute until 8 o'clock. Are there any other committee member comments? Andrea?
I just want to say, Renfries, thank you so much for bringing this back to us. I really left our last conversation wanting there to be a next step, and I thank you for taking the initiative and thinking through why it mattered for us to respond and what the contents of that response could be. Thank you. And Sam and staff, thank you for taking putting your effort in a first draft.
Okay. I equally likewise, Renfries, I want to thank you for that. And one thing that I think we didn't call out is that building where this happened is the building that BPS will be moving to in a year or so. So it is not lost. That part is not lost on us. So I appreciate that. Thank you, Renfries.
And thank you, and I appreciate everyone on this committee. And I think I appreciate the leadership here and the folks who actually are on the front lines and doing the work. I think it's I think this is it is timely, and it is something that we should work towards. So yeah, thanks everyone, and look forward to working with you all on this moving forward.
All right. Well, it's exactly 8 o'clock. It was an exceptionally well-timed end to the conversation. Thank you all. Next week, we'll still have an hour left. I'll update the meeting invite, and we will look forward to kind of diving back into some of the changes that we made to the application and to the scoring criteria, as well as reviewing the first draft of the letter. Night, y'all.
Good night, everyone.
Thanks, folks.